Welcome to the third installment of the ground check discussions organized by the German Archaeological Insitute. We will start with our session. We've already looked at the data available on past climate change and have learned how early societies, prehistoric societies, have dealt with these challenges. And today we want to focus on the impact of water, or rather the loss of it. The availability of water is an important constraint even today. So we are in Berlin here. The dry summers hit the agriculture in the lands near Berlin really badly. They fueled forest fires in Australia and California. They led to water shortages in many regions of the world. However, these are not new problems. Throughout history, societies had to adapt to water scarcity, and how they managed to do that is the focus of our discussion number 3, water management and desertification. We will revisit oases, this time on the Arabian Peninsula. We will hear about early water harvesting systems in Jordan and learn about some ancient water management systems that are still going strong in Andalusia and Sri Lanka. And on a slightly different tack, there are water problems in historical gardens right here in Berlin and Brandenburg. And maybe these gardeners from today can learn something from far off places and far away times. We will start again with 4 short presentations. Then there will be a discussion among the speakers. And finally, all of you can add comments, can ask questions. And you can do this either using the chat function of Zoom, or you can join us via Facebook or Twitter. And I encourage you to post your comments and questions already during the talks so that we have material for the discussion. Now, let me introduce the speakers for today. There is Dr. Bernd Müller-Neuhof. He's an archaeologist specialized in Southwest Asia, and he's affiliated with the German Archaeological Insitute. And at the same institute, Dr. Arnulf Hausleiter is scientific researcher for the archaeology of the Arabian Peninsula. Brigitta Schütt is professor for physical geography at the Freie University Berlin. And last but not least, the gardener and landscape architect, Professor Michael Rohde, is director of the gardens of the Stiftung Preußische Schlösser und Gärten Berlin-Brandenburg. This foundation is in charge of the historical gardens and the historical palaces of Prussia. So let's start off with northeast Jordan. Today, Java is situated in a desert full of stones. And when you see it from above, you see structures. So what did the people of the Bronze Age do and use them for, Dr. Müller-Neuhof?
Yeah, good evening. I will give a few minutes some information about the innovative strategies to tackle climate changes in the prehistory of northeastern Jordan, namely in the early Bronze Age of Java. What you see here on the first slide is a quite unusual picture. It is a flooded mud pan in the basalt desert where Java is located. And this was after a torrential rainstorm. But this is a very good example for one of the most important features of all these irrigation systems, which is the catchment area and the catchment control. I will refer to it in the next minutes. In the last almost 10 years, we have carried out several archaeological surveys and excavations in an area here in the northeast of Jordan, in the basalt desert. And in this area, we have identified several hill fort sites, hill fort settlements, dating into the late Chalcolithic, early Bronze Age, which is the last quarter of the 5th millennium and until the end of the 4th millennium before Christ. Java, here located in the western area of the area, was already known since the 1960s. A very interesting feature of all these sites, you can see here some aerial photos of these hill fort sites, are terrace garden structures, which are located on the foot of these volcanic elevations or beside of the volcanic elevations. Here is Java. And we could figure out an evolution of terraced garden agriculture from linear to reticular systems. And the main feature or the main characteristic of these gardens is that they were all artificially irrigated by local runoff. So there are no rivers in the area, so there are no springs, and a precipitation rate below 100 millimeter per year per square meter, which is far too less for rain-fed agriculture. So the people were able to use the catchment areas, mostly the areas of the elevations where the sites were sitting on, or the areas around the sites. A very important thing is the climate development during this time. I was talking about the late 5th and the 4th millennium. Here we have a climate proxy from the Dead Sea. This is the surface, this is the sea level of the Dead Sea, and you can see these fluctuations here. It's difficult to say if these situations of the Dead Sea can be compared with the situation in the basalt desert, but this is one of our closest climate proxies. And at least we can see here the strong fluctuations. So the people settling in the basalt desert had to react on these changes of precipitation and climate changes. Java, here's an aerial photo, is very well known for this massive fortification wall. Is a 10-hectare site. And in the beginning in 2010, 2011, we discovered these net-like structures of Terrace Gardens. Here we have 3 garden areas which we identified close to Java, which is located on the Wadi Rajil. The hydraulic features in the Terrace Gardens are canals such as these, terrace walls which are totally collapsed meanwhile, but you can still see the line out due to the linear structures with the whitish stones and the black stones, and then these inlets and overflows for controlling the water inlet into the gardens. Interesting feature are the catchment areas for the terrace gardens, which are here shaded in gray. We have a very small catchment area of almost 6 square kilometers, but we also have some hydraulic structures in the Wadi Rajil, which derives from the Hauran Mountains with precipitation more than 400 millimeters. And these structures have been used for storing water in pools, and this water was brought in by channels from these wadis. Beside of Java, we have also the oldest dam in the world, which was also filled, the reservoir was filled by the local precipitation of Java. So we have 2 different catchment systems which supported the survival of the people of Java. And especially the local catchment system for the irrigation is very important. And due to a very intelligent approach of tapping adjacent elevations with channels and to catch the water from the area, they were able to guide the water into the gardens, into the sediments where it saturated and kept moisture for a while, and was used for carrying out agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is a situation where water is very hard to come by. There are other places in deserts where there is a continuous water source, oasis. So one example is Taima in the north of the Arabian Peninsula. Did the people there have to cope with aridification as well, Dr. Hausleiter?
So yes, good evening, everybody. I hope you can see the presentation. Yeah, of course I had to face it, but in a completely different way, because contrary to what Bernd Müller-Neuhof illustrated just a minute ago, an oasis is characterized by completely different water availability, and especially in the case of Taima, which you can see here on the map of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course I had to add the palm trees, which at Taima occur very late in the history, I should add. So the cliche of a palm tree oasis and with some camels running around is actually a very late phenomenon in the whole history. But coming back to your question, Taima is located here. You can see it belongs to the aquifer, Sak aquifer, which covers a large part of Jordan and the northwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula. It's characterized by a specific situation because groundwater, according to our hydrological team, was never really a problem. It was always there, so to say. And you can see the Taima fault, which is a geological phenomenon where the later oasis has been then placed on, is basically responsible for the constant supply of groundwater. There's, similar to what Bernd Müller-Neuhof just explained, a catchment area of 11,000 square kilometers. And still today, as in the very beginnings of oasis cultivation, irrigation features have been used to exploit the water. In this case, you see a map of more than 80 wells, historical wells. Ancient wells have actually not been found many in the archaeological excavation, but to the early irrigation devices we come we will have a look at them in a minute. So the water supply, of course, is a completely different situation compared to, because it's groundwater, compared to the eastern desert in Java. And the acidification, we come back to that in a second. This table by Michelle Dinius, you have met her 2 weeks ago, and who is in charge of the climatic studies based on proxies, botanical proxies from Tema, identifies a period here marked in orange of an abrupt retreat of grassland expansion of certain types of plants. On the other hand, and this is quite interesting, and you saw this 8,000 BP event also in the table of Müller-Neuhof. On the other hand, one should point out that the grass and plants which were suitable for grazing, they were always there. So the idea that the oasis started to come into an existence because of shortage of grazing resources for mobile pastoralists and forced them into settlers is completely wrong, or you can abandon it, because these are two different developments. So it's not that the oasis replaces mobile lifestyles. On the right side, just for your information, you can see the archaeological period. So we have been connected the paleo-environmental data with the archaeological data, Tema 12 and 11. Interesting is that based on palynology, so the pollen, there are already in the 9th millennium before today, indications for cereals, but grass and cereals are not really cannot be really well differentiated. So I hatched this area, so there's at least the potential for cereal cultivation. However, the oasis in terms of fruit cultivation starts a little bit later, around 7,000 years before today. And again, as I mentioned before, it's not the date palm, it's a fruit tree cultivation, grapevine and figs. And as to the figs, I should add the natural distribution of grapevine is further north to Tema, 500 kilometers distance, which underlines that this oasis, as many others, are human-made oasis. So it's an artificial cultivation of this grapevine there. So this is basically just how we get our data. In the north of the oasis, there's a 20 kilometers large salty paleo lake, which was never suitable for drinking, of feeding animals or humans, but it created a fantastic geoarchive, which has been drilled. You can see here some prepared drill cores, and up right, you see a pollen diagram. And on the left bottom on the map, you see the transects which we have been drilling throughout this Sabha, and some microscope photographs of these pollen, how they look. So it's really complicated and long-lasting lab work behind these reconstructions, and the hypothesis one core usually takes half a year or 3/4 of a year to be analyzed. So now to irrigation. So it's not that the water was just there. So even in an oasis, as one could say, irrigation plays a very important role. And due to the fact that Tema, and you see here a satellite, an aerial photograph from the 50s of the last century, is a palimpsest. So large parts of the oasis are settled by modern occupation. So the actual investigation of soils or areas which have been used for irrigation is really complicated. I just want to focus on two aspects. First of all, to the right, traces of a possible early irrigation system as identified by geomagnetic prospection in the Sabha area. There are structures which can be identified as possible irrigation channels. We are planning to go back there and to do some soundings. And this is quite interesting because it puts early irrigation in the north of the Arabian Peninsula at the transition to from the 5th to the 4th millennium BCE, which, however, is not a surprise if considering other regions which we have been looking at a second ago. I will probably not enter the discussion about this social dimension. However, I should say that it probably later in the discussion we may discuss about in which way the oases fit into the established model of urbanization, irrigation, or older models of Oriental despoty, how societies were organized around these oases. So I don't go into the detail now, but I think Mr. Wildermuth will come back to that after all the presentations. So I just go on with my one of my last slides. So just to see that the continuation of irrigation devices is a constant phenomenon at Tema. Here we have an irrigation system, which is Bronze Age, late Bronze Age irrigation system, very complicated. And what is quite interesting, and this is very important to underline, is the high degree of investment into these structures. They have been constantly changed, repaired, and modified. So it's not that they put just one irrigation system which lasts forever, but there's constant repair, there's sinkholes, and it's a very complex system. But also here in this case, in the southern part of the oasis, the system was abandoned at a certain point, probably due to a shift in the groundwater table, because the feeding source well in the southern part of the oasis at the end fell dry. So again, we have this interaction and the high investment, and again, it's environmental factors playing their own role in the whole system. Of course, if we talk about permanent settlers, cultivars, and cultivators, the oasis as an agro system, an oasis is in a way by nature an isolated place similar to islands. And that is why we started to investigate the surroundings of Tema in an unsystematic way until now, because Tema, like many other oases, are defined by their extreme connectivity to other regions, and this starting from the Chalcolithic period onwards. Just to show this map, and then I'm done, you see more than 30 wells, which are still used today, distributed all over what we would call the desert. So was the desert ever dry? But I don't want to answer this question. Of course it was dry, but it was at least possible for mobile pastoralists, as it is today, because these waterholes are still active today, to be used. And if you look at this map and you put maps of similar kind, or you carry out investigations around other oases, you will find similar waterholes. And this makes it then understandable why connectivity, why mobile pastoralists, why caravan trade was possible and did not exclusively depend on the oasis, which were, of course, the huge focal points and the distribution centers for commercial activities. But this just needs to be further investigated. So the oases are an important part of the story, but only one part of the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've now looked at two types of irrigation systems in very different situations, but they were all very dry. And they impress both with their physical structures, how much stones have to put in place to really guide the water towards the fields. However, every irrigation system has an equally important social structures, and it's harder to learn about these social structures which keeps these physical structures going. So where can we find hints how they worked, Professor Schütt?
Thank you very much for this introduction and for just the question, the hint you gave me. Yes, it is really impressive to see the understanding of landscape people of early cultures had, and especially the engineering performance they had to change the processes in the landscapes. And you are right, we have to be aware that the implementation as well as the maintenance of these structures necessary to keep them running required strong and complex organizational structures. And so this directly leads us into a very up-to-date discussion. The discussion on the planning tool of integrated watershed management, which is promising sustainability as it considers the capacity of the landscape as a whole on the one hand, as well as the needs of the population, while it includes the ecology and the socio-economic development. Bringing that to the point, we all experience every day that technical development brings us many fantastic inventions to us, but it takes time that it is accepted by us, because we have habits, we have routines, have things which we like because we are used to it. And the same happens when measures for landscape conservation and usage are implemented. And there are many on the modern market which are tried to be implemented, but here we cannot afford to fail, and we do not have the time to wait. And in this context, it helps to know how the local cultures developed and what are their habits, what is their cultural heritage, and especially in drylands, and we learned already about that, water management practices are frequently, since generations, part of the cultural heritage, including the technical knowledge as well as the governance structures. And usually the people are very proud on their cultural heritage and they want to preserve it. And I think this we should use. But while in the field, it is mostly obvious to identify the engineering products, it usually requires either to study written sources or to conduct in-depth anthropological research to receive information on past governance structures, and this highly limits the study subjects. And I just want to give you some insight in such an interrelation from our neighborhood, from Spain. This wonderful valley is the Vega de Vélez Blanco. It is located in the eastern margin of the Betic Cordillera in Andalusia, and it was already settled latest since Neolithic, but probably most important inventions, technical revolutions, as well as spatial reorganization, were implemented during Muslim period, beginning with the Arab rule in the 8th century. And in the one or the other way, still are in practice until today. Taking bird-eye view, you see here the surrounding mountains, and like an eagle's nest, the village of Vélez Blanco, and the green in the center are the gardening areas of the Vega. And then you see a network of dashed lines, marking deeply incised dry valleys, and more important, a network of canals, which frequently pass by ponds. Looking at these elements in the countryside, we see here one of these main canals transporting spring water from the mountain into the Vega, charging it into balsas. These are artificial ponds owned by irrigation communities, where the water is temporarily stored until it is used for irrigation. One example for such temporary storage is the Balsa Alara, an irrigation basin with a maximum capacity of a little bit less than 300 cubic meters, and water is fed there every day between 6 in the evening and 6 in the morning. And then in the next morning, it gets distributed through canals with a network of more than 100 kilometers in length to the individual fields, which are all over terraced. And to protect the downslope Vega areas in this altogether mountainous area, you find upslope, where the area is hilly to mountainous and less fertile, sophisticated conservation measures which protect the downslope gardening areas. Coming back to the allocation of the water. Like in medieval times, today, 8 larger irrigation balsas, basins, exist in the Vega of Vélez Blanco. Their content is measured in terms of volume, as I told you, a little bit less than 300 cubic meters, while the water distributed from the balsas via the canals into the field is still today measured in time-based units, the so-called hilas. In the community of Vélez Blanco, by law, water and land are inseparable, bound to each other. That means owning land, you belong due to the location of your land to an irrigation community, and you have the right on a certain share of water to irrigate your land. And when this educated share of water is not enough, you can buy additional water from an irrigation, for irrigation in a water auction at the Alpujon, a common law body that owns the water rights of the springs in the area in Valles Blanco, manages the irrigation water, and maintains the infrastructure for distributing and storing the water. This Alpujon has existed since the Muslim period, and it is even today one of the most important institutions for the citizens of Valles Blanco. Here in this picture, you see such a water auction, which we visited with our students and the revenues from the water auctions still today are used to pay for the water, to pay the water trustee, that is the guy in the background, and the maintenance of the irrigation system. So what we nicely see by the example of Valles Blanco is that by the Arab inventions, techniques, law, and governance were brought to the area. Over the centuries, these practices had to be adapted again and again to changing political and legal conditions. And this can be followed nicely in the historical sources. And until today, the local population is strongly interconnected to its cultural heritage, still is practicing it where it makes sense, and combines it with modern technologies, observations, which you can also make in other cultures, which complying these frame conditions have one thing in common: their water management systems work. And it mostly works over centuries, and so I think we can call it without hesitation sustainable. And this brings me to my finalizing statement. When we want to practice sustainable water management, a sustainable management of natural resources, we should apply local knowledge, which is mostly deeply rooted in the culture, and combine it with modern techniques in education, in planning, and in application. And that is my central message. Thank you very much.
So now, thank you for the input. We have now learned about the physical structures, about the social structures, and there are water scarcity problems not only in the past and not only far away, but right here in Germany, in Berlin, in Brandenburg. The water scarcity is a problem, and this poses special challenges to historical sites, historical gardens, which are in these regions planned by Linné or by Fürst Pückler. So Professor Rohde, what are the challenges you face to keep these historical gardens in their historical shape?
Yes, hello everybody. So I will talk about historic gardens, and let me first say that historic gardens are traditionally very old. It's a big part of the culture of mankind, and we know gardens which are 4,000 or 6,000 years old. So we have some examples. Yeah, Berlin-Brandenburg, you see here, is very dry area in the East Germany part. And we have, since, let me say, 10 years, a lot of problems with extreme weather conditions, with heat periods. And so we have to deal with strategies and how we can bring the water right to the topic, right to the gardens. So the difference, what we see is in the last years, we have a minus of maybe the half of the rain that comes every year. So this problem is very near to us. So and the consequences is that the soils are dry up and the vitality of the vegetation is very problematic. So we have 4 strategies necessary to preserve historic gardens as cultural heritage, as cultural monuments. It's first of all the water management. We need enough water and keep it in the soil. So we have soil improvements. And the next is that we think about the plant use and plant protection. And also the fourth topic is that we have material at this area that we can use. So let me show you what the strategies look like. First, we normally remove the industrial water. It's water from the rivers. And beside this, we have to check if we can use more groundwater, beside maybe 10–20%, 80% from the rivers. And the problem is that in this time, the rivers get lower. So there comes a competition about industrial water and groundwater. The history of the irrigation in our parks is as old as the parks, of course. There's one interesting point in the 1820s, 1840s, as there was the use of the steam engine. So they built steam engine to bring the water on the hills, and then to keep it there, the same topic as we saw before, and pump the water in this bassins. And from there we have pipes to bring the water in the area we need in the parks. Here, this example from Park Babelsberg near the Glienicke Bridge. We have to keep the water resources very specific to the young trees, which we have to replant every year. And you see some examples here. And also we think about new techniques, maybe automatic irrigation to bring the water in the night, maybe, or exactly to the replanted areas. And we think also to use water from waterways to take new methods to remove water from especially sustainability from septic tanks or something. This is maybe we have to take care of the water we have in the area and how we use it. Also, in combination with this, we have to think about the mulching of the soil, because then the water is more in the soil. And so for that, we use our own green material and also bring special substrates and fertilizers into the soil. And the principle you see here, what we could do to have better conditions for our cultural heritage, to keep the plants vitally. My last example here is that we have research programs on our foundation. For example, a research about 3 years with the Technical University of Berlin to test, to have field tests, as you can see on the left here, to identify genotypes, to identify the vitality, and we use different substrates to keep the plants. So, and the result is that we can have a better condition to increase available water, to the extension of the water supply for the plants you see here. So this is always a combination with gardeners' experience and also the methods of bringing water for the irrigation. So these are some examples. I'm very interested in the discussion now. Thank you.
Just to clear it up, there's a question, what is a septic tank? I think it's a tank.
Yeah, I know the English word is when die Wasserwiedergewinnung von Kläranlagen, das gereinigte Wasser wieder zu benutzen.
So
Mit dem Boden
als coming up from water treatment plants, which is used in the gardens, and you bring it in these big tanks.
Yes.
You've seen on one of the photos.
With 1 meter filter of the soil to bring it back, and then it comes back to the nature. Yeah.
So one thing was very interesting in your talk. There was this terra preta, this special coal, which is an example of a traditional knowledge from the Amazon region, which is now used in the gardens in Berlin and Brandenburg to cope with the challenge of aridization. And this brings me to one point when before we start, we will now start as a discussion, but I will remind you there are already questions coming in, so please join the discussion. I will try to bring it into the main discussion when it fits. So we've seen several big structures which were already done in the Bronze Age, really intricate technical things. So from a technical point of view, how good were these engineers of the Bronze Age? So they're really very sophisticated. How good were they? What compared to a modern engineer? This is a question for the archaeologists Hausleiter and Müller-Neuhof. So how impressed are you by the engineering solutions these people found?
It's still quite difficult to say, because the systems we have identified at Java and also the other sites in the hinterland of Java in the basalt desert are, as far as we know until now, the most ancient systems for, most ancient complex irrigation systems. Irrigation technologies in the Middle East are going back as far as the early Neolithic period, which is 9th and 8th millennium BCE. But the earliest one always also have been identified in Jordan, in the southeast of Jordan, in the desert. But these were systems which consisted out of small scale barrages of wide wadis, which collected the sediments. And then in the rain period, the sediments were saturated with the wadi runoff, and these areas have then been used for agriculture. But this was a very simple system. But these systems here are the fourth and especially the fifth and the fourth millennium at Java and the other sites are the earliest complex systems we have. And it looks very advanced. But the most important thing is that these people, they know their environment. They knew the topography. They knew what happens when there is rainfall, where is the water flowing, where is the runoff, where do you have areas where the water is collected naturally. I think these were the most important features they had in their mind. And we know it from traditional irrigation systems, either from Australia, but also from the southwest of the United States, that these indigenous irrigation systems very much relied on the knowledge of the local topography and the local environment. And we think that these systems in the Java area were developed by local people. There is no evidence for engineers coming from somewhere else. So they were engineers in a way, but it's very difficult, I think, now, because we haven't made. I mean, we're now planning for a new project there with hydrologists looking more closely to the techniques and the engineering characteristics. It's difficult to judge it on the current situation.
So, Dr. Hausleiter, do you think it's more that people adapted to these different water availabilities through a process of trial and error, try to build a channel here, okay, it doesn't work, break it down, build it at another place? Or are these huge structures you see around Taima, are they planned from a long hand with the big picture in place?
Well, I think it's somewhere in between. I'm sure there was trial and error, but we should never underestimate the people of the past. And I always say sometimes that archaeology is a history of underestimation of our predecessors. I think we all agree, and that's I got from Professor Schütt and Bernd's Müller-Neuhof's statements, that the local knowledge was essential for making such a system survive. And I mean, of course, there's the highly developed terracing systems in southern part of the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, and their erosion and just statics matter, as in the case probably also of Java, that these installations just don't fall down the hill. So, and of course, there was surely trial and error, even though it's really difficult then to evidence that in the archaeological record. What we can say, and our hydrologists are also engineers, so their admiration is somehow limited probably by nature. So we appreciated the system probably more in quotation marks than them, but it was clearly visible that, and this is something which probably adds to what has been said before, the consciousness of the need of keeping the system running was deeply rooted. And of course, this is a source for innovation, and call it trial and error, but, or not but, I think this is how it was a constant development. We often use the term development just randomly, but I think this, you can really call it like this. So there was systems which failed, or a channel which collapsed, or even though it's difficult to find it. I only say that the irrigation system I showed you at the very end, it was a very flat area, but within 50 or 70 centimeters, there's 3 levels of canals, and then there was the decision to be made to rebuild it or to reuse it or to repair it. So it was a number of decisions. There was a high competence of these people in the Bronze Age. Apart from knowing the gravitation principle, because all these systems are working by the gravity of the Earth, of the magnetism. So did they have a plan? Yeah, I think it's an understanding of the topography of the landscape and an understanding of the need. And this is always a question whether there was a plan and how the first houses were built. So probably with the canals, it's probably easier. I think there's a observation of the nature, which probably us as urban citizens are not even able to imagine how closely they were linked to the nature, as we are linked today to the smartphone, as I would say. So I think it's really, we have to, if we consider, we want to talk about what happened in the past, we have really to try to leave our modern world. We have, of course, to do the ethnographic analogy. We have to work with models. This is also very important. We can't tell you the truth. We just have models and operate with models. So in this sense, we would be also certainly arriving and telling, of course, there was a plan, because each construction needs a plan. But on the other hand, it's complex to answer these questions in a very easy way.
So these were structures which were really big, the structures you showed, and the one dam that Bernd Müller-Neuhof showed. These are really big structures, and usually we associate big structures with hierarchical societies. So whereas these societies really already build layers and hierarchies. So when we look at the presentation from Brigitta Schütt, there seems to be a more democratic organization of the water management. So how's the balance between, on the one hand, hierarchy to get people to do what they should, and on the other hand, democracy to distribute the water fairly?
You're asking me?
Yeah, for example.
Well, I would say it depends on. I can give you another example. For going to Sri Lanka, where you also have very ancient systems running since minimum 2,500 years and still being in use in the same hierarchical structures like in former times, where big structures, big ponds or big tanks were constructed, and under the rule of the kings while at the same time, the small tanks close to villages, which were also practiced in very complex systems, were under the organization of villages. And these were two systems existing parallel. So both is possible. And in Spain, for example, when you go to Andalusia, yes, obviously the local population was integrated into the management of the system, and people were responsible also for maintenance. But at the same time, it was part of the law. So nothing happened there by random. And the law also was in a way always adapted when over the more than 1,000 years of history of this area and these systems, we had changing governmental systems. And so it was never beyond hierarchy.
So do we know anything about hierarchy or more egalitarian society organization in Java or Tema?
Well, I mean, I can refer to my own slide, which I didn't explain actually. So in the Near East, and especially in the pre-modern periods, we have been working with models, and one very, how to say, known one is the one of the Oriental Despoty and the Hydraulic Society. I mean, research in the last 25 years has shown, and that has also to do with the expansion, let's say, of the view of the archaeology of Western Asia, adopting a more regional perspective, that we have a high degree of regionalization. So, which means we have local and the understanding of topography, as what was discussed before, is essential to this. We have complex irrigation systems in the highlands of South Arabia. We have southern Mesopotamia with a completely different natural environmental setting. And all this runs either parallel or even not. And this is quite interesting, and a question which cannot probably really be answered. But as far as Tema is concerned, we are basically adopting models from the Levant, where there's a big discussion about the emergence of complex societies connected to the use of irrigation and walls, public buildings, administration systems. This is basically the toolkit for considering or for understanding or for understanding of complex societies. And this often implies a hierarchical system. The problem is, of course, that in not all areas of the Near East or Western Asia, you have the same set of data available. I mean, in Uruk, for example, you have a list of professions, we have written sources. In other areas, you have different types of sources. So we have to work like our colleagues from the sciences with proxies. So is a wall a sign for a chief commander or chief citizen or for an elite commissioning this wall, or is it a communal work? And in the Oasis, we are not really sure. We have proposed on other occasions a kind of a communal organization, which is possible, especially since not all of these walls have been built for fortificatory needs. A large wall of Tema has been built in order to keep the saline sediments from the Sabra, from this Paleo lake, away from the agricultural land. So this is just an example. So it's quite difficult to say. And then it depends, of course, how many people you are living there. There are models saying, and that they're of course connected to ethnographic research, that a certain quantity of people require a hierarchical organization. But again, we shouldn't underestimate these societies. So it's not automatically said that a big oasis with large walls, with a huge irrigation system requires, by definition, the existence of a hierarchical system or of a permanent hierarchical system. So probably these were solutions which were adapted. Of course, if you have workmen, you need to organize them. But probably that was just something which was due to the fact that the system had to be built, a wall had to be built, irrigation system had to be built. But then this need was over. So probably we have to think of a more flexible system than rather adopting a permanent hierarchy. And I'm talking about the evidence we have. And in other cases, of course, we have a fantastic set of sources, legal water rights. You can interview participants in modern irrigation systems. I mean, this is a problem archaeologists have.
Do we know anything about Java?
Yeah, the interesting thing is in all the sites of the late 5th and 4th millennium in the basalt desert, we have no evidence for any hierarchy, even though we have fortification walls, we have these irrigation systems, but we have no buildings referring to religion like temples. We have no administrative buildings. We have no buildings which can be interpreted as being palaces. The dwelling area or the houses, they have all more or less the same size. They look like an U.S. American suburb in their catalog-like structure. So I think, meanwhile, for the for the early Bronze Age 1, which is the late 5th and the 4th millennium BCE, we can rule out hierarchies like chiefdoms or early states for the area. What we are thinking about are segmentary societies, and this is a quite good exit for our thoughts. We know it from traditional societies in Africa and in Southeast Asia, that these are something between egalitarian and chiefdoms, and they have, for specific purposes, they have chiefs or bosses, which were responsible for a specific purpose, either warfare or religion or other things. And so what I can assume is that for the issues of implementing a irrigation system such as in Java, there were a few people who were specialists in this purpose. They knew the issue about organizing irrigation, and they were acknowledged by all the other members of the society. So they were in charge of organizing these structures, the buildings, the implementation. They were in charge of organizing the workforce, and later on they were probably in charge also of organizing the management of the structures and how the structures have been kept up and these things. So I think these were not the high class of the society. These were specific specialists, and they were acknowledged by all the other people. So I think these segmentary society issues are quite good way to get out of this trap of being between Wittfogel and I don't know, something out of space.
So now we've talked about the physical structures, about the social structures, but there's a whole package if an irrigation system is to work. So there are the right plants, for example. So have you any idea what plants were used in Java?
Well, we have not many evidence from the gardens themselves. We have evidence for poide grasses, which also includes cereals. But we have evidence from the excavations in Java from the 1970s, and this is not clear if all the plants they identified in the charcoal remains came from Java originally. But we have a broad spectrum of different cereals and pulses. We have even grapes there, and I remember they also found dates in their remains. I don't believe that we have dates on some in this area. We are almost on 1,000 meters above sea level in Java, but grapes is possible, and some other plants as well. So there's a quite a large number of charcoal remains there. And the other sites where we just made some archaeological soundings, we have almost no charcoal remains from any plants from agriculture. Just some some references to white grasses, but not very much.
So if you look at irrigation system as a combination of technique, social, and biological elements, Professor Rohde, to keep your historic gardens going, do you have to change the biological element to keep the garden going in a drier environment?
Yeah, let me say first that we have a congress next week, and we included a colleague of the German Archaeological Institute and Phoenix Arnulf digged out a garden which is 4,600 years old in Egypt, and he deals with different sciences. And you question about the plants. They have fruit trees which are not from that area, so they brought fruit trees from another area to the garden of Pharaoh Snofu at that area. So there's in the history is always a change and dealing with plants. But since, let me say, 100 years, we have a method of keeping cultural heritage, historic gardens as cultural heritage. And for that, we deal with convention and with conservation plans to keep the garden as it was laid out by Linné, for example. And we have to show today the authentic formal garden design. So we cannot change the arts of plants. We have to replant the same oak on the same place. If we can identify how the laying out was. This is the first question, but I know what you will ask now. What would we do if it's getting drier and more heat and all these things? This is, by the way, this is a highly political topic now. So we work this. First of all, if it's getting warmer and dry, we need a good maintenance, of course. But also we need science for our 4 strategies. And I talked about that in the introduction. First of all, of course, we can find out if we can use other plants which are more sustainable, which could more use. For example, the Stieleiche, that means Quercus robur, we can change to the Traubeneiche, that means Quercus another oak sort.
Different oaks.
Different oaks, for example. So you can go with you can deal with the others, but you have to show the former design authentically. And then we have to deal with soil and with water and with fertilizer and with cultural substrates, for example. And now we have to look how many water we have. We have to deal to keep the water in the parks, to try to also to be very carefully about the rain, to keep the rainwater in the parks, and all these little things to be more carefully, because our parks are very it's a living monument. Huh? Yeah.
So are there any things the historical, the archaeologists or the physical geographer can extract from your studies to help building more sustainable agriculture or sustainable ways to manage modern gardens? So are there some lessons to be learned? So I know that Bernd Müller-Neuhof intends to try to reconstruct some of the water harvesting systems to show if they would still work.
Yeah, if you ask me, you just...
It's for all of you.
Yeah, let me say only one thing. The Maya took the green coal, let me say green coal, to have better conditions for the soil. Yeah, so this is one example.
So are there things we can learn from your study sites?
I mean, I think I agree with Professor Schütt, and I think, yeah, that the knowledge and the identification of present-day groups on a local level with their own past and with the traditional techniques. This is a key element, I think, for creating the understanding. But I think the story is not that easy as far in the area where I'm working, because it depends on the economization of life, of the aspects of modernity, of innovation as a positively connotated development. The diesel pump, they are the worst tool for all over the region where we're all working and even beyond. And if I think that the Sark aquifer, which I showed you at the very beginning, reaching from Java basically to Tama, if in view of what we know now about recharge of groundwater and the exploitation, within 50, 60 years, it will be exhausted. It will be just no water anymore. So I think it's twofold: to take this knowledge and to take this identification and the looking back to the past as a very positive attitude. It's a matter of education, but it's also a matter how really, what is the solution or the alternative? And I think the idea of maximization, or the capitalistic approach, to put it in very simple words, is really, or the maximizing of exploitation, the continuous growth, is one of the aspects in terms of the countries or the parts of the West, giving an example, for example, for other parts of the world. This is something which I think is fundamental and needs to be revised and needs to be discussed. And again, one has to offer alternatives and to deconstruct certain models we are used to. And we have been living after the World War II in Europe. We have been building up everywhere in the world and so on. So I think this is important, that we have to find a way how to communicate, how to think about the options, the alternatives. And we cannot just go there and say, okay, look, this is what we excavated together in our joint projects, and we agree that it's a fantastic system and so on. And then we cannot just say, okay, now do it because it's good for your environment. I mean, that is completely impossible, and it's very difficult. So it needs communication, education, understanding, and it's a long process. And probably the global climatic change at the moment could be a trigger for starting this. And in this sense, it's of course important to connect climatic change and cultural heritage, because they are connected. And what you are asking us is basically tackling this issue. But one should not be optimistic or over-optimistic that it will be a simple solution, as I would say.
I think also, if I may add something, I think also it's the big question is how these traditions of agriculture and irrigations are implemented in the local society. I mean, we had the example from Spain by Professor Brigitta Schütt, which is the long tradition of at least 1,400 years or something like that. And we have some similar structures also, some similar systems also in other places of the world, and also in Jordan and in the west of Jordan, in the Ajloun Mountains. But the example here in the basalt desert is that after roughly 3000 BCE, the entire system collapsed. So all these sites, all these settlements were left voluntarily by the people. There was a drought. And even though in the third and the second millennium, we had some periods with probably more precipitation, no one used the desert anymore. And then we had a quite good precipitation situation in the Roman Byzantine period. And in this time, there was a lot of infrastructure work done by the authorities, but these infrastructure on water harvesting only relied on collecting water for husbandry purposes. So there was no agriculture anymore. I mean, there was no agriculture with artificial irrigation. They have used the wadi terraces for sowing some cereals, especially for feeding the animals. But there's no tradition in the area on connected with irrigation agriculture. So when we start to reconstruct some of the systems, I think it's very difficult to convince the local people to use it. I think the only possibility is to show them that it works and that they can increase the fodder for the sheep and goats, so they can plant fodder for their flocks. But I think the big issue is the lacking long tradition on agriculture and irrigation, and then all the modernity things Arnulf Hausleiter was mentioning with the diesel pump and water trucks.
Professor Schütt, yeah.
Yes, I don't want to comment on Dr. Müller-Neuhof, but on Dr. Hausleiter, because I would want to suggest to change point of view. I think it is less that we go and consult what to implement and what to do and how to act. But I think when we work in these areas, it should be more that we ask, and that we ask for what is wanted and how they want to do it and what is practiced and what is necessary. And my feeling is in many fields, especially in development aid, that this level of participation was a big gap in the past decades. And I think with going into also the habits, the cultural heritage of what the people have, and asking what they want and what they can bring in and what they know, this could be a very big step forward. Also going into the dimension of sustainable implementation of these measures necessary.
I want to pick up some questions from the audience.
May I just give a short
yeah,
reply?
Yeah.
I fully agree, of course, and nobody of us goes there and tells them what to do. But what I wanted to express is not so much that we tell them how is the best way of living, but that in some cases it's really difficult to reveal what is wanted, if not the most modern and most efficient system of exploitation, and to create an understanding for the consequences. And this is something which I think is needed by discussion. I fully agree with that. And by asking, of course, and that's what ethnography is about. So I think it cannot be done by just importing an alternative solution and then telling someone, and then we leave after 2 months of field season and leave them alone with the problems. That's of course not the point. But I think it depends on the region and on the intensity of the interaction with our partners, our local partners.
So there were several questions in the audience on the sustainability of these types of structures, because they lasted for hundreds and thousands of years. So is this an indicator of their sustainability, or do they break down nowadays when they are faced with modern challenges? So are these traditional systems flexible enough when they are still existing to adapt to the challenge of modernity? I think this is a question for Professor Schütt, because your systems are still going, and Professor Hausleiter as well. So the oases are still cultivated.
Yes, the systems are still going, but I think the challenges we have in these days with modernity are extreme. So when we looked for the changes in the past centuries, when we go to other continents with colonization, when we, well, also in Spain we had colonization. It was not a problem. They could adapt, but these days we have, I think, the problem that we have a very strong usage of techniques we frequently don't understand. And people using the techniques not necessarily understand the ecology. And what just Dr. Hausleiter said, they don't know what is happening in 10 or 20 years when they use it. That is the thing on the one hand. And the other thing is that there is, well, money is a big issue. And when you have the money, you don't take care for the environment. Let's go back to Spain. This area I showed you, it is the area of the biggest, that is the biggest production area of jamón de serrano in Spain. When you buy a jamón de serrano here, it probably comes from that area. That means when you go into the Vega, next to the gardens, you find a lot of pig stables. And obviously, these farmers have other financial resources to get water. And they happen two things. They drill deep wells, and the water going into the Vega, it is spring water. And obviously also the pig farmers, they go and bid at the auctions for the water. And they have much other money resources than the olive farmers. So on the one hand, we get conflict between the people there, and that is a modern problem that came up the last 20 years. And on the other hand, they are exhausting the resources by drilling deep wells, which get into the water resources before they get into the Vega. And well, this is really a problem.
Does someone want to add this perspective on the question of flexibility and sustainability of these ancient systems of water usage? If not, then I'll pick up another question from the audience. There are several questions which with an archaeology point of view. So Friederike Fless wants to know if these systems you described in the Arabian region, are they similar to the systems which are today used in Ethiopia and in Somalia with terraces? So no, obviously not.
Maybe I'm allowed to answer. Yeah. I don't know Somalia, but I think I know Ethiopia pretty well. And in Ethiopia, in very wide areas, the habit to terrace land goes back into the 1980s. And when you go in that Aksumite area, I think it can be that some of these terraces are very old and they are still in use, because in Ethiopia, all land is in use. But as far as I know, we have not proven that yet. And we are waiting to get there to take the samples to date it. But when you go across Tigray and also across Amara, the predominance of the terrace systems you find there. And meanwhile, it's terrace everywhere. It is a thing of the last 30 years.
Okay. And there's another question about salinization. So these old systems, how did they deal with the problem of accumulating salt? Professor Dr. Hausleiter, you already said that they built a big wall at Taima to keep the salt from the salt lake out. So how did they deal with the salt in their field, which is a problem always when you irrigate?
So the latter, honestly, we don't really know. And I just want to add that this wall was just big enough to keep the salt away. We did core drillings on either side of this wall, and it was quite amazing to have the result there. But what happened on the actual fields, we don't know. So as I said before, Tema, for most of its part, is either being used by modern oasis cultivation with all its effects, or it's inhabited by modern housing. So it really, there's not much areas to investigate that. And we have a project then to investigate by soundings and drillings, but at the moment we don't know about the effects of salinization in ancient times at Tema.
Yeah, at Java, we cannot say yet, because this will be the issue of the next project, to do some very detailed soil analysis if we can trace any evidence for too much salt in the soil. But we also don't know how long the system existed at the end. It was not very long, maybe it was 100 years or so, but it was comparable short, because as I said, at the end of the 4th millennium, the site was abandoned. So this will be an issue for the upcoming research.
Do we have any idea why the site was abandoned? So was there a drought which they couldn't keep up with, or?
Yes, as I said, we have in the beginning of the 3rd millennium, we have a drought, and this is also shown in the Dead Sea Proxy and other proxies. The interesting thing is that after, let's say, at the end of the third millennium, there was a wetter period again, or within the third millennium, but we have no evidence for a reoccupation of the basalt desert area, at least not by sedentary populations. So our hypothesis is meanwhile that starting already in the late Neolithic, when the population, the basalt desert increased, especially by people coming from the western area, like western part of Jordan, and even beyond the Jordan River, they brought their animals, their flocks with them, sheep and goats, and for almost 2,000 years, increasing use of the basalt desert, which was not a basalt desert in these days. It was a dry area, but with a complete existing surface cover, with soil, with vegetation, with some smaller lakes and ponds. Using these sheep and goats and doing husbandry there was a very big impact on the environment of the area. So meanwhile, we think that the area was totally exhausted at the end of the fourth millennium and was never reused again until the Roman Byzantine period. Then
there's a interconnection between a climatic change and population growth getting too big, which is a problem for all of these traditional water usage systems, because when more people need to live on the land, they're no longer sustainable. I think that's probably true for the oasis as well as sites in Spain and Sri Lanka.
May I ask a question to Professor Rohde?
What is the question, please?
The question is whether any of your gardens under your administration, apart from, let's say, examples for didactical purposes for kids or for learning people, education, has ever been used for economic purposes, or are these gardens all for decoration or for pleasure or whatever? And if so, do you research on that?
Of course, it's our target to explain the gardens, to show the gardens, especially for pupils, for teachers and kids. And we have a lot of programs. For example, this year we have the slogan to plant green future with kids, and they are so interested and have many questions, and they want to come back to see what they planted. And we explain a lot of things also with climate change. And we have all these topics with garden art, the beauty of the gardens, the history. Why is the garden in Charlottenburg in this architectural manner, and especially not influenced by the Netherlands, but more by the French Versailles as the example. And Sophie Charlotte wrote to André Lenôtre, design me my garden here in Berlin. And what is the relationship from mankind to the nature? And it changed, and that was at that time a big topic that changed to landscaping, the landscape garden. As we said, the painting garden. Why was that? Because there was a kind of revolution against the geometrical gardens, and this is a highly political topic. It was a political topic, so we could explain why the nature was the example to build gardens. So we have a lot of different designing topics in the long history, and we could say the antique gardens is so different, and we have a lot of garden types. These gardens are all palaces gardens, but we also have public gardens built. Public gardens had a fairly different purpose. for recreation in different manners. So the laying out was different, and we have to explain to use garden with rules. You cannot do everything in these gardens, but you can do a lot in these gardens. So was that the question?
Okay, we can't hear you right now.
Yeah, I think yes, part of it, but I think there may be other questions from the audience. So.
Yeah, so I want to encourage the audience to ask further questions. There's a comment from Henk van Schaik. He says that there's a water and heritage, scientific commission on water and heritage that tries to set up a registrar for ancient water heritage sites, and he wants to get in contact with all of you. So if any of you in the audience still have questions, now is the time to ask them. Now the experts are still available. And while we're waiting, there's one thing that I wonder about. Irrigation systems are, per definition, they are set in place. You aren't mobile anymore, and they are a resource which can be fought over. So when people start to sit in a place and start building irrigation system, is this, in a sense, a way that paves the way for conflict, because other people might want to come into these already established structures?
Well, to start with, the sedentary lifestyle or sedentary base economy, subsistence economy, is not only depending on irrigation system. I mean, we know it from the beginning of the Neolithic, with the beginning of sedentary lifestyle. You have the resources which are sedentary as well, such as agriculture. So this already made it difficult for groups to move in, because they were relying on a specific area, on a specific territory, and you already had this conflict issue between groups in these times. Irrigation is another thing. I mean, we know in the area of the basalt desert from the beginning of the early Neolithic, or the end of the Epipaleolithic period, when the people are starting to become sedentary, we have the first villages in the area, and they were living there all the year round, and they used the local things they had there. They were hunting, they were collecting, they had water, they had everything more or less. We don't know if they had conflicts, but maybe. The issue or the combination between the irrigation structures we have discovered and the fortification walls we had is not that the fortification walls were built to protect the irrigation structures. Our hypothesis is meanwhile that the fortification walls serve for other purposes. One idea is for controlling exchange or communication routes, but I think more that in these volcanoes we have there, we have evidence for water sources. We have lava caves, at least at Java, below the settlement. And our new working hypothesis is that these sites were natural water sources, where natural cisterns were placed there, where water accumulated during the rain season. And this water could be used for drinking by the people, because the problem is we have runoff for irrigation there. We have water collected in open ponds for the animals, but we have no water sources for people. And people cannot rely on water which is saturated in the sediments to drink, and they cannot rely on water stored for weeks and months in open ponds. So they had to have fresh water, and the best idea is to keep the fresh water in natural cisterns or caverns. So meanwhile, we think that these fortification walls were built around these elevations, these volcanoes, where they had access to such natural water sources. And this forced the people in this time, in the fifth and fourth millennium, where they're very, very much depending also on husbandry and mobile pastoralism or semi-mobile pastoralism, forced them to become very sedentary, and they built the terrace structures probably for their own needs to have some agricultural products which they couldn't exchange because they were not so mobile anymore in the area.
There's another question from the audience, from Louise Rain. She asks, since all these ancient irrigation structures are cultural heritage, they could become a center of tourism, which can be, on the other hand, a real pressure on water resources. So do we see a conflict between, as archaeologists, describing these interesting structures and that tourists come there, and by their overuse of water can be a problem for the sites?
Well, I think going to Spain, for example, and it is, or going to Sri Lanka or wherever, I think the number of tourists going for a bath in the sea compared to the number of tourists being interested in traditional water management systems, there is a big gap. And so that I doubt that especially these target group will make a problem. I think the problem might be the others.
And in our case, we always have the competition with Petra in Jordan. This really gets all the tourists more or less. And the other problem is Java is located 6 kilometers area distance from the Syrian border. It's safe, but you know, tourists and tourist agents, they have other views on the things. Well, yeah, I mean, we would like to have tourists at Java. No issue with that.
It's a problem in Morocco, says Louise Rain. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to add, I mean, it depends really also on the situation on the Raven Peninsula. The water issue is basically ubiquitous everywhere. So it's basically taken for granted. So I would doubt that there would be a special, I mean, if you visit an oasis, that's one thing, but you would not particularly be interested in the irrigation issues, but in all the features you can see there. And it depends, of course, on the tourism which is developed or to which degree it is developed. But I just want to add that because there were some questions before, Cultural Heritage of Water is there are 2 volumes which have been edited 3 years ago by ICOMOS, and they are online available. And many of other regions we have been discussing today are dealt with under the aspects of cultural heritage. So just this as a kind of additional information to some of the people from the audience.
Maybe you can put this up in the Facebook stream so they can read about it. There's one last question we can pick up. It's by Diana Acosta, and she's interested in this situation in Spain. And she asks, are there protections in place to keep these water management systems going? Because you already mentioned the pressure of the pig farmers, but there might be cash crops as well. So will they go in the next 20 years? Will they still be available? Professor Schütt.
So as far as I know, there is no governmental umbrella protecting these systems, but the communities where the systems exist, and it is more than one. So when you go into the areas of Valencia, Andalusia, you find several of these systems. The people are aware of what they have, and they fight for it to keep it. And so I hope, I believe in that that they can continue what is there, but I think the economic pressure of competing land uses is very strong, and maybe it will just survive when there will be some governmental pressure that they will not be overwhelmed. But as far as I know, it is not cultural heritage yet, and I think it would be wonderful.
That's a nice closing remark, that the people are really interested and invested in their cultural heritage in irrigation, where they still are using it. So this was our third ground check discussion focused on water, on the lack thereof. And I want to invite you to the fourth issue, which is still dealing with water, but now with a surplus of water. The session is titled Impact of Climate Change on Cultural Heritage, Coastal Risk and Flooding. So it's not about how old cultures used water, but how can we protect our cultural heritage sites when the sea level is rising, when there's torrential rainfall, when there's flooding. So it will be next week, again on Wednesday, the 14th of October at 6 p.m. And I hope many of you will join. So thank you for now and have a nice evening. Thank you for all the speakers for your input. And it was really a very nice discussion. Thanks and goodbye.